This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You have reached the edge of the world, and do I ever mean that today. Linda Moulton Howe has uncovered something completely unexpected and completely mind-blowing in Alaska. Listen to one of her most incredible interviews, a very, very strange situation, and one I, for one, certainly never expected. Plus, for UnknownCountry.com subscribers, another of those incredible contactee interviews. Ann Strieber has done quite a number of these at this point, and they are absolutely fascinating. There's a new one for you this week. Don't miss it. Plus, don't miss the new Whitley Strieber meditation that we posted during the week. So if you're a subscriber, you've got 2 new treats, and if you're not, well, how about this? Also, go to the UnknownCountry.com website and get your new UnknownCountry.com tote bag. Want yours free? Well, subscribe to UnknownCountry.com for a year, and that's exactly what you'll get. If you're already a 1-year subscriber and your subscription comes up during this promotion, you will get your tote bag free as well. If you're not a 1-year subscriber, go to the subscriber section. You'll get $3 off, taking the price down from $8.95 to $5.95. For those of you who aren't subscribers and would just like a tote bag, well, it's $8.95, the UnknownCountry.com store. And now, one reporter who loves mysteries and knows how to handle them is our own Emmy Award-winning Linda Moulton Howe, the reporter and editor for EarthFiles.com. And here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. I returned from Göbekli Tepe, Turkey on June 15, 2012, and reported in the 6-part Earth Files about the 30 acres of limestone pillars placed in circles 12,000 years ago and then buried about 11,000 years ago, completely over. In that Turkey trip, we also visited mysterious Mount Nemrut north of Göbekli Tepe. The upper 160-some feet of that mountain is completely artificially covered, as well with very similar-sized stones. What is behind the phenomenon of burying ancient structures? Was there another burial of a pyramid larger than Cheops in western Alaska between Mount McKinley and Nome? On June 22nd, 2012, a week after I returned from Turkey, I received an email suggesting that that is in fact true. The email came from a retired U.S. Army counterintelligence warrant officer named Douglas Allen Muchler. I am using his full name with his permission. He was writing about yet another alleged underground burial, this one, a pyramid-shaped structure underground, perhaps 4 times in volume the size of the Great Pyramid in Egypt, found by seismologists and geophysicists allegedly studying the Earth's crust during the May 22, 1992 nuclear detonation test underground of a 1 megaton bomb. That really did happen. In his email, he says, I assure you, I am telling you the truth about this, an underground pyramid in Alaska. And I think that this is being kept quiet by our government, as the news was also buried the very next day after it was brought to my attention in a broadcast. If you can help me get this information, please call me so I can talk to you about it. And then I got his phone number, and I asked him first to send me his DD-214 discharge information, a military photograph, any information about his service as a Chief Warrant II officer in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence. And he did send me hard copies of first his DD-214. On March 10th, 1981, he entered active duty in the U.S. Army with basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama. And then, based on his test scores, he was requested to join an advanced training for something called 97 Bravo 10. It was an experimental counterintelligence unit with the idea that the Army needed to increase the number of human intelligence agents that it had working for it, known as HUMINT. And this advanced training that he was put through was at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and that is the U.S. Army's intelligence center. By 8 years later, in June 29th, 1989, he was asked by his superiors to transition to warrant officer school at Fort Rucker, Alabama, and he came out with what is called a Chief Warrant Officer 2, CW2 rank. He personally wanted to go to Alaska, so he asked for duty at Fort Richardson. And part of his reason was his father had served in the military, loved Alaska, and the son wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. On May 22nd, 1992, 3 years after arriving at Fort Richardson in his Chief Warrant Officer counterintelligence work, Douglas Mutchler learned that in Lop Nor, China, that there was a large underground nuclear detonation. Now, what he talked to me about what happened 5 months later, in November of 1992, involves Channel 13 in Anchorage, Alaska, that has changed affiliation in numbers over these many years, but it has always been Anchorage's largest, most popular station. And he said that he was in the Fort Richardson orderly room with 39 other men in the last week of November of 1992 or the first week of December 1992, when they all listened with amazement to the in-depth TV news report on Channel 13 about the extraordinary discovery of a very large pyramid underground in Alaska between Mount McKinley and Nome. Afterward, Doug went to his room to program his VCR to tape the next newscast because he wanted to study this. He had been exposed in his work in the Fort Richardson work to maps made by the Defense Mapping Agency with dates on them of 70, 71, and 72. And on those Alaska maps, there was approximately a 5x7 section between Mount McKinley and Nome that was completely whited out with words saying this area of Alaska had not been surveyed. As a counterintelligence officer working with the United States Army, he knew that couldn't be true. He knew that everything in the United States had long been surveyed by satellites. So why would there be any map put out by the Defense Mapping Agency that would have a large, whited out area in Alaska? That really bothered him. And then in November or early December 1992, he and his colleagues are listening in the orderly room at Fort Richardson, and here is his explanation, he thinks. Oh, it's blocked out because there is something there that they have been keeping quiet until now. So he called up the station when the newscast did not replay on his VCR and said that he wanted to come down and get a copy. He goes down physically to Channel 13 in Anchorage, and for reasons unknown, it is the general manager that Doug Mutchler insists came to greet him and told him, quote, "We never broadcast such a story," close quote. And Doug Mutchler, out of counterintelligence, says that he knew he was being lied to and that the story did not end there. He was heading out of Channel 13 after the strange conversation with the general manager denying that there was any broadcast the night before that he and 39 others, 40 of them, had watched and talked about. And he said that a technician came over to him, tapped him on the shoulder, and said quietly, "Yes, we broadcast that story, but there's nothing I can do to help you. We were told to erase it." Now he was really confused, And he was haunted from 92, and that occurring up until current modern days. He is now on physical disability from injuries he suffered during his Army intelligence work, and has the time to try to inquire about this mystery of both the map and the broadcast that he has never been able to find, and wanting me to see if I could find out more information about the possible truth of a underground structure, pyramid-shaped, at least twice to 4 times the volume of Cheops that he heard on that TV station. Well, now, we talked on the phone quite a few times leading up to my saying, let's do a formal recorded interview. And that was scheduled for Tuesday, July 17th, 2012 at 9:30 a.m. I had my radio studio all turned on. Precisely at 9:30, I dialed the phone number that I had dialed even just the night before to confirm that he was feeling okay because he has to take pain medicine for disc problems in his back that is part of his physical disability. And he said that, yes, he would be fine for the 9:30 a.m. interview. And what am I confronted with when I dial that number? It is a single ring and a voice comes on, a recorded operator that says, quote, "This number has been disconnected," close quote. No other information. I tried the number again, same thing. I tried it again, same thing. I went to my computer. I sent an urgent email. Doug Muchler, this is Linda Moulton Howe, earthfiles.com and Premier Radio Networks and Dreamland Online. I am trying to reach you for our formal interview. Would you please call me? That day passes. The next day passes. Nothing. I'm very worried about what has happened to this man. And finally, on Friday, July 20th, in the afternoon, the phone rang, and it was Doug Muchler. And he said, I just have been wondering what happened, why you didn't call me for the interview. And when I asked him if he had seen my email, he had not. And he said that he tried, and his wife was there and heard him try, to call me on the afternoon of July 17th, a few hours after 9:30. He said, I waited thinking that you might have had some emergency in work, and I called to see if we could still do the interview. When I told him I had never received any voicemail from him, even though I received many other voicemails that day, he said, quote, then someone is specifically targeting your phone number and my phone number. The government can do that. I know this. They can do anything they want to in this digital age, close quote. Frustrated that such an electronic manipulation of our phones had been done, we turned around almost instantly then and recorded a full interview beginning with Doug's reaction to the phone interference.
Well, as a past intelligence operative and knowing how the government works, they're covering something. But something's up there, and somebody is hiding it.
Now let's go forward with the story that appears to be so sensitive that extra effort is being made to block us. So now, would you go back, as I understand, that you are working counterintelligence as a warrant officer, CW2, and that you were in Anchorage, Alaska, at Fort Richardson, and we are beginning this story in 1989.
I asked to go to Alaska as my first duty station as a warrant officer because my dad was stationed there, and he loved the place. I went there, and when I arrived, one of the first things I did was go and get maps because I wanted to prospect. So I went to the GSA office, and I picked up every map that made up Alaska. They were the Joint Operation Graphic Ground Maps, scale 1 to 250,000. And it covered the whole bedroom wall and the ceiling. I mean, these are really detailed maps. And I got to one of them that was on the western portion of the state, and it was whited out. There was a whole section about the size of a Christmas card, and it said this area not surveyed as of this date. And the first thing I thought was, that's ridiculous. I mean, they've had the Earth mapped since like the 60s. And I know Alaska was mapped out right after World War II. But anyways, it didn't make sense for this to be whited out. They're hiding something. In my mind, what I was into, counterintelligence, there's something there. But I had no need to know. Then I'm out processing, 1992. And we're sitting there. It was in late November, early December. And I'm sitting there in the orderly room with about 40 other people. And we were waiting for the last formation of the day. And we're watching the TV. A news program was on. And they started talking about this Chinese detonation of an underground nuclear bomb that was set off earlier that year.
May 22nd, 1992.
Okay. And they were talking about that, how big it was. And then there was a byline. And the story was about geologists around the world had been informed through the UN because China had told the UN they were going to do this. And so these geologists got together and they said, let's get the best recordings of the Earth's crust and mantle using the vibrations from this explosion. And what they found in this byline story was under Alaska, they found a pyramid bigger than the one in Egypt. They said they didn't know whether it was solid or hollow. They couldn't tell that, but they had the distinct outline of a pyramid.
And this was supposed to be where?
That whited out area, the area that showed on the TV, were south of Mount McKinley, and it was towards the west, near the Nome area. There's an area there that was whited out, quite a large area, really. And when I saw the news program, I mean, it's in my mind's eye, I could see it just right where the whiteout area was. Well, I knew that the whole world has been surveyed. So why was this whited out? It didn't make any sense. I was like, oh, man, I got to get this tonight. So I went home, and I got a recorder and set it up. No story. I called home, the lower 48, to my dad, and he religiously, my dad is a TV hound, especially a news hound, morning, noon, evening, and 11 o'clock. He watches them all. He heard nothing about it, not a thing. I mean, it's a big story, bigger than the one in Egypt, and it's not being covered in the lower 48.
Meaning, as if either there was some block on the story getting into the United States, or the story had been picked up only by the local Channel 13 station in Anchorage.
That's the only thing I could come up with myself. But the thing is, I went the next day to the station and asked if I could get a copy of that story. And I was talking to the general manager, asking for it. And he said, what story? We didn't run no story about no pyramid. And I was like, sure you did. There's 40 of us guys and they watched it on TV. And he denied it ever running. And I was just perplexed. Knowing what I know, I thought to myself, this guy's been got to. He's covering. I mean, it's the only thing that could be.
And what you mean is that the United States government, when push comes to shove, and the Department of Defense says that something is sensitive, they can interact with management in TV stations or networks and say, don't run that story.
They do it all the time.
Yes.
That's a matter of record. So I was walking out, and there was a technician, and he was sitting there staring at me. And the way he acted, he's like, come here, you know. And I walked over, and I said, can you help me with this? He goes, man, we ran that, but I can't get it for you. It's gone. I can't help you. But it ran. I was mad. I went back to the office in formation that night. I told everybody what I'd found out, and the guys in the unit were like, wait a minute, we watched it. What do you mean they didn't run it? You know, the same thing I was saying. So I have tried to find that news program. And somebody out there has to have been recording their kid's ball game or wrestling match or something, and they've got it. Somebody has to have it. And I'd love to get it because I want to find out where those grid coordinates are.
What happened about a year later in 1993 when you went to Fort Meade?
Okay, I was going through a lot of operations during this period of time. I was the commander at Fort Leonard Wood. That was a small detachment. And when I was working on a book for doing background investigations, and then we had another thing that we were working on terrorism around that area. It was a thing we were working with the FBI. So part of my job was to go to Fort Meade, where they have storehouses of information. I'll just put it that way. I don't want to get into too much.
Everybody listening, and myself included, when they hear Fort Meade, they automatically think of the National Security Agency. Is that where you were?
No, and I don't want to get into the building or the organization. It's a building that is an SCI type of building, Special Compartmented Information. I don't want to get into the name of the building or who runs it, but it is a military thing. But it's just a big warehouse where they have rows and rows and rows and rows of combination safes.
So it's an archive for highly classified sensitive material.
Right. I was looking for what I was looking for. And then when I was done, I thought maybe they have something about this pyramid. So I went to I guess it would be like a librarian, and I asked him if he had anything on archaeological sites. I didn't say pyramid, but I said archaeological sites or underground facilities in Alaska. He said, well, if we do, it might be in container X, Y, or Z. So I went over there, and I was just looking around, and I really didn't find anything saying pyramid, but I grabbed a couple of Alaska, like 2 different safes, and I had just sat down, and these 2 guys came. You can feel someone standing behind you, and these 2 goons go, hey, you don't have a need to know for that information. And I turned around and said, what do you mean? And he was like, you don't have a need to know. You're going to have to leave. I said, well, I'm just looking for something. We know what you're looking for. And the other guy, somehow in that conversation, he goes, they don't want us messing with them up there anymore. They don't want you messing with them up there. They don't want us anybody messing with them.
Up there.
And the guy who was standing with him, the bigger guy, his head just shot over, and he looked at his partner, and you could tell he was just glaring at him. And I was like flustered because I was thinking, what did he just tell me? They don't want any of us messing with them anymore?
Up there, right? And up there,
yeah,
from where you were at Fort Meade in Maryland would certainly be up there, you could imply.
Alaska, because the folder I had was Alaska.
And the question is, who is them and exactly what's up there, and why would this TV broadcast about a pyramid larger than Cheops found between Mount McKinley and Nome be off limits to anybody in the world knowing?
Right. When I first thought of this, I was thinking archaeologically. This was underground, so it must have been covered over by the Ice Age. And I was thinking, God, I wonder what's in there. It might have the capstone still. But when this guy talked about they, my whole mind started going, who are they? What am I stepping into here? It stuck with me.
And what are they doing in Alaska if it's true that there's some sort of an underground pyramid? Whose pyramid? Constructed when? And who has been involved underground? What does all this mean?
Well, they said it was greatly larger than the one in Egypt.
Greatly larger than, and that would be Cheops.
And the way they were talking, and that's why I want to get this program. I mean, they did a great job. They had the whole world. They had it sliced out where it was and how big it was in proportion. I mean, this thing was huge in the proportional graph they showed. And I was like, whoa. this has got to be news. But everybody covered it up. So what's up there? And now, who's up there? That's the thing that kept me trying to find somebody who could help me find this information. That's why I contacted you. There's got to be not only those guys that were in the orderly room that day, but the geologists who did that research. One of you has got to have the information about that pyramid. It's been long enough. It's been 20-some years.
You got out of the Army in November of 1995. We're talking in July of 2012. What is it that finally provoked you to seek me and others out?
My age. The clock's running. It's been long enough.
You are how old in July of 2012?
55.
So at age 55, with physical disabilities, this has haunted you since November of 1992.
It has haunted me. I mean, really.
I wondered how any large pyramid-shaped structure discovered in the Earth's crust during an underground nuclear test could be hidden from seismologists and geophysicists. So I took the question to Paul Vincent, Ph.D., geophysicist in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University in Corvallis. In the 1990s, Professor Vincent studied Earth crustal changes during underground nuclear tests for Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Berkeley, California. Here now is Professor and geophysicist Paul Vincent, Ph.D., from Oregon State University.
Talking about a pyramidal structure, I suspect they might be talking about some of the oil traps up there.
What would be the image that they would have used on TV if they were showing this, which this man said that he saw? Would it be ground-penetrating radar or what?
Well, it depends on how deep they're talking about, but if there's man-made structures, I would be looking at a seismic reflection profile. And those are things that oil companies do all the time. They pump the ground with a stimulation source, like a big piston that hits the ground at known frequencies, and then they have a whole string of geophones or seismometers strung out at known distances from their source or pumping positions, and they get seismic arrival times at each of those geophones at known distances, and they can map that travel time to depth. And so you get kind of a cross-section of what's underground that way. Ground-penetrating radar is for more shallow stuff, for shallow mines or trying to find buried pipe or shallow archaeological structures. But if you want to go deeper, you use seismic reflection and seismic refraction studies with an active source. An active source being either hitting a steel plate with a sledgehammer or you have a seismic device.
Or on May 22nd, 1992, the Chinese underground test would have at least given seismologists and geophysicists some sort of reverberation through the crust to study?
Yeah, seismic waves, but not to resolve any man-made structures. When the waves arrive at seismic stations from the source, varies more in the crust than it does in the mantle. And so our biggest source of uncertainty in travel times, which is critical in locating events, is through the crust. So the reason why nuclear tests are so valuable for understanding the crustal structure is because it's a large seismic source that is very shallow. Earthquakes happen at much deeper depths, several kilometers.
Right.
And so they're not embedded in the shallow crust like underground nuclear tests are.
And have you personally, in all of your work, ever seen a seismic profile from the Nome area because of underground nuclear tests, those kind of profiles from there?
No, you don't get profiles from teleseismic distances. The profiles are from the seismic reflection and refraction surveys that in order to get a profile, you have to string a string of geophones or seismometers out at relatively short distances, one every 100 meters or less apart. And when we're talking about China, we're talking about a source that something like that would look like the exact same thing on an array of geophones that would use for doing these cross-section imaging stuff that I'm talking about. They would all look the same, so it makes no sense to do that.
And we're talking about the nuclear underground test site in China versus Nome, Alaska.
Right.
And how many miles would that be? I don't know.
China to Alaska, a few thousand miles.
From your long experience, a underground nuclear test in China and then somebody picking up a signature in Nome, Alaska, what would be typically known to geophysicists that would be the only possible data that you could learn in Nome, Alaska from an underground nuclear test at the underground test site in China?
The only information that we can get from underground nuclear test source that far away is the crustal structure between China, where the test is, and the seismic stations that pick up the signal.
And back in 1992, could we have picked up any detailed underground data from that China test in Nome, Alaska?
Sure, yes, we did.
What you're saying is if we were looking at that data, what would we see?
A seismogram. We would see a typical explosion source time function. It's an explosive source, so everywhere around that test, the rock is compressed, meaning the seismic trace goes up. That's not counting any complicated reflections and phase transitions between P waves and S waves.
And if you yourself have been in Nome, Alaska, say looking at equipment that might have been set up by somebody to take advantage of that test, what could you have seen that might be underground in Nome, Alaska, or in that area?
Nothing. You cannot use teleseismic data to image something man-made that's very shallow underneath you.
I don't fully understand why we wouldn't see shapes of things.
Because there's so many more things that affect the data, the seismic energy, because it's coming from such a long distance. There's so many more things in the crust that will perturb that seismic ray. By the time it gets to you in Alaska, there's the unknowns in what's affecting the propagation of that seismic ray. So it's an integrated effect of thousands of miles of rock. Any effect of any structure locally would only be observed if your station happened to be, the chances of having this supposed structure between you and the test in China, the odds would be astronomical. If you drew several curved rays between the test location in China and different points in Alaska, and then you imagine this supposed pyramidal structure that's buried, then you have to draw it pretty small if it's man-made. Even if you were to bury the Great Pyramid, it'd be like a tiny dot, small perturbation in the seismic data.
Now, Professor Vincent did not deny that a pyramid could have been found underground in Alaska at the time of the Lop Nor China underground seismic test on May 22, 1992. But he stressed the need for a straight line between any nuclear test and seismic stations. Well, I shared this interview with Doug Muchler and Professor Vincent on my Coast to Coast AM broadcast July 26th to 27th, 2012. And afterwards, I received an email from a retired Navy captain and professional engineer who found a large, what he called square, anomalous square in Google Maps in which each side of the square that you can see on the ground measures exactly twice the length of each side of the Cheops Great Pyramid in Egypt. He was shocked by this, that the math would even be there. And he wrote to me at Earth Files, quote, approximately 50 miles northwest of Mount McKinley, just to the north of the line, connecting it to Nome, I came across this square shape that was very distinct in the ground. And there are images of this in my Earth Files news report about the possible underground pyramid between Mount McKinley and Nome. It is a 3-part series at Earth Files, and the Navy commander's images from Google Earth showing the square are in my Earth Files report. He said the area is a flat plain, approximately 1,950 feet altitude, the coloration of the anomaly is a darkish green, and there doesn't appear to be any type of surface structure. This is a very desolate area in the center of the state. However, the coloration is so distinctly different than the immediate surrounding area. There are others nearby that have the same color, but they are irregular in shape. This area that I noticed is a distinct square. My assumption is that if there is something below the surface, it could be impacting the flora, the plants at the surface, which somehow mirrors the shape and dimensions of a structure below. In this case, it looks like a large square. Perhaps it is a thermal differential that promotes growth of some other chemical physical effect. I have no way to know other than observing this square anomaly, close quote. And he also said, what is even a little more interesting is that I measured the dimensions of this square that is visible. The length each of the four sides equals 1,510 feet. The interesting thing about this dimension is that it is exactly twice the length of the side of each side of the Great Pyramid at Giza, which each side there measures 755 feet long. 2 times 755 equals 1,510. The coincidence is interesting to say the least. This would make this square anomaly on the surface 4 times the area of the base of the Great Pyramid, which at least is consistent with your witness who said the underground pyramid that was supposedly identified during the May 22nd, 1992 Chinese underground test and described on Channel 13 in November or December was much larger than the Great Pyramid at Giza. Then I posted this at Earth Files, the Navy commander's work and some others, and I began receiving many, many emails from professional engineers, professional seismologists, geologists who have taken a great interest in this story. And one was offering that the whole area in Alaska, somewhere around that Mount McKinley and going kind of in a circle around Mount McKinley, could perhaps relate to the famous Pat Price remote viewer who had worked for the Stanford Research Institute under Hal Puthoff in the 1970s, and in 1973 he had reported in one of his remote viewing sessions that he did on his own, not part of the SRI work, that, quote, inside or under Mount Hayes, northeast of Mount McKinley, that he saw an underground UFO base. Now, Jim Marrs, our friend and the New York Times bestselling author, wrote a 2007 book called Sci Spies about Pat Price's remote viewing and described it as an underground UFO base in Alaska that was, quote, a weather and geological study center located under Mount Hayes, close quote. But the problem in all of this is that you've got the 1973 remote viewing by a talented remote viewer who was working for a highly credible institution, the Stanford Research Institute at the time, along with others in remote viewing exercises, and this was one of his reports. But everything that Doug Muchler remembers from the Channel 13 Anchorage broadcast that he and his colleagues saw was that they showed a map very clearly in detail, cut away, showing how the pyramid was under the crust, and that it was distinctly between Mount McKinley and Nome, which is going to the west of Mount McKinley, not going northeast to Mount Hayes. So maybe there are 2 anomalies in Alaska, but we're concentrating on what might be underground between Mount McKinley and Nome that might relate to this Channel 13 broadcast back in late November or early December of 1992. Now, as you go forward, on July 1 July 2012 emailer to Earth Files that I got after the broadcast and after posting the Navy commander's work came from a very serious investigator. I have known him for 20-some years. He is extremely knowledgeable about everything that was happening with Project Paperclip at the White Sands Missile Range, had a colleague in the Naval Research Lab there, and has taken a great interest in this report about this underground pyramid, possibly in Alaska. And he sent me an email that stated, quote, "On this underground pyramid story, have you ever heard of the Alaskan Bermuda Triangle? It seems that there is an area roughly from Juneau to about where you've identified the pyramid," meaning the Navy commander's latitude and longitude that he supplied for the anomalous square, "east to the Yukon, where a number of planes have simply disappeared. One was Hale Boggs, U.S. Speaker of the House in the early 1970s, who disappeared on a flight from Anchorage to Juneau. The bodies and the plane were never found." And then he goes on that Yakutat, which is notorious for terrible weather, is northwest of Juneau, and McCarthy is northwest of Yakutat, and McCarthy is the area where allegedly the plane disappeared. Lots of aircraft accidents and disappearances. The famous Japan Airlines flight that picked up the UFO on its tail was flying over this exact region when they noticed the huge UFO in the sky. And then my emailer colleague who has done a lot of investigation says, quote, "My source has also sent information about seismograph stations in Puckey Pile, spelled P-U-R-C-K-E-Y-P-I-L-E, and some people call it Perky Pile. I've heard both pronunciations, and Toledo, Alaska." He says there is a seismograph station at Perky Pile, Alaska, as well as an airstrip, and that it is several miles south of your GPS coordinates from the Navy commander of the anomalous square. The seismograph station is designated PPLA and has been there for a number of years. There is also another seismograph station at Toledo, Alaska, which is several miles northwest of your square anomaly, discovered by the retired Navy commander. And Toledo also has an airstrip. And then he says the geophysicist, Paul Vincent, PhD, said at the end of his interview that an underground man-made pyramid structure would not have been noticeable unless the seismographic station happened to be immediately adjacent to the man-made structure, in which case it would have been noticeable in the seismograph, especially if it were large and had a substantial vertical component. And then he finished by saying, quote, that he's talking about Professor Vincent said, "The odds of that were minuscule." Without saying what I said above, you might call him back and ask, what if the seismographic station was within a mile or two of the large subterranean structure? If you are right about the location based upon the Navy commander's input, then you are looking for the seismic data from USGS station PPLA the day of the China test. If it's not available then, you have another mystery. Why is that data not available? Well, I received another very important and valuable email from the U.S. Navy commander retired. He had gone to Google Earth further beyond finding the anomalous square, and he wanted to see what would happen if he did what's called a grand circle, like if you took a latitude or a longitude around the Earth, only he wanted to see if he had a line, that was straight from Lop Nor, China, and the underground seismic test that occurred on May 22nd, 1992, and you went to Perky Pile, Alaska, and that seismic station, what would he see? And here's what he wrote. "I have been examining with regard to this anomaly and found an interesting thing. The supposed seismic sensor at Porcupine is related to a comment that your website received after your initial posting about the TV broadcast. And that comment, and he's referring to Professor Vincent, indicated that the only way an analysis of the nuclear explosion could detect an underground object were if the object was located on a straight line between the explosion in China and the monitoring sensor in Alaska, indicating that the underground mass would somehow affect the transmission of the sound vibration as it passed by or through it on the path to the sensor. And he's talking about under the crust of the Earth that scientists were studying. I went back on Google Earth and created a great circle path from the square anomaly to Loch Nor. And then he gives the bearings, and he provided a graphic that shows a red line that is the great circle connecting China to the seismic station in Alaska. And then he wrote, I don't think it would be possible to get a line closer to a straight line between Porcupine, Alaska, and its seismic sensor and the Loch Nor China explosion than 0.112 degrees, which is what he calculated on his Google Map research. Since the anomaly is between the Loch Nor test site and the known seismic sensor at Porcupine, I would think that if such an anomaly could be detected, the relative positions of Porcupine, Loch Nor, and the anomaly would not preclude detection. I don't know if the Porcupine, Alaska seismic sensor would identify an underground pyramid structure, but if the requirement is that the anomaly has to be on a straight line connecting the Loch Nor explosion to the sensor in Alaska, then I think we can check that box as a straight line, close quote. And it doesn't end even there. After I posted all of the work of the retired Navy commander on doing the Great Circle and finding that there is essentially a straight line between Porcupine in Alaska and the Loch Nor China detonation, I received an email that says this, quote, when I heard your story about pyramids in Alaska, I was shocked to say the least. I was instantly reminded of the stories my father told me. He was a World War II Navy veteran, now called in Seabees, now called the Navy SEALs. He often talked about Pearl Harbor, Europe, and his time in Japan. But what always fascinated me were the tales of his time in Alaska from 1959 through 1961. After the war, he earned a degree in electrical engineering and physics. After finishing college, he was recruited by the military to join a group of other experts to study and work at an underground structure in Alaska that, in his words, they called the, quote, dark pyramid, close quote. He spoke numerous times of how seriously the government took this project and the steps they took to keep it a secret. I always assumed it was a military installation. He said it was a study of energy distribution. He went on to be the key leader of the information bubble for AT&T, which of course was the precursor to the web and cell phone technology we all know today. In his later years, he would always complain when receiving his electric bill that it would be free if we knew the truth. We attributed much of what he said to perhaps old age dementia. Now I'm starting to think he knew a whole lot more than we ever gave him credit for. I'm in the process of going through his old papers and studies to see if there is any reference to his time in Alaska. And I am waiting to learn more, but I want to tell the Dreamland audience and Earth Files viewers, this is not the only email that I have received from people who seem to have other knowledge about some sort of a pyramidal structure underground in Alaska that they have heard about in their military careers. Whitley.
Linda, once again, I'm kind of at a loss because what you're talking about seems so fantastic and yet so plausible.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. We have a situation. Are you looking at? I think you might be looking at some kind of a buried base rather than an ancient pyramid, or both.
Well, and the issue is who built it. If it is non-human, which I think has come up in discussions even among those guys at Fort Richardson, if it is a non-human buried yet again, like Göbekli Tepe, like Mount Nemrut, like so many ancient sites, so many things they are finding in Turkey, it is as if they were created incredible and then laid down carefully and covered over. What in the world 12,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, 10,000, 9,000, Catalhoyuk is around 9,000. That was also much underground. Why was there a preoccupation with constructions of things that are astonishing and then burying them under dirt? Did it have something to do with the anticipation of something from the cosmos? As I have discussed at Earth Files, I've done several interviews with University of Arizona scientists who are convinced that 11,000 years ago, comets and asteroids and God only knows what literally came and hit on the North American side of this planet and caused havoc around the Earth. Would there have been intelligences terraforming this planet that were not human during the Ice Age, before the last Ice Age, and that they had advanced information, and that everything, including pyramids, Göbekli Tepe, Catalhoyuk, and on, would have been buried for reasons still not understood, but for protection? I don't have the answers, but what I'm going to appeal today is if there is anyone in the Dreamland Earth Files audience who has any more information of any kind, on or off the record, they can share with me from military experience, science experience, or any other field, please email me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. All requests for confidentiality are honored at all times. My goal is to understand what are the facts here, what is the truth. If there is a pyramid that is 2 to 4 times the volume of Cheops in Egypt, underground in Alaska, west of Mount McKinley on a line going toward Nome, who built it? When did they build it? Why did they build it? And who were the Fort Meade security people referring to when they said, quote, they don't want you or anyone bothering them up there, close quote.
Well, Linda, all I can say is this. I have sitting in my ear an object that was placed there by human beings whom I remember doing it, using technologies that the doctors couldn't even begin to understand. It's real. It means to me that there is a breakaway civilization, human civilization, that is in some way involved with us. Are they also involved with aliens? And if we were to be able to somehow get down into that mysterious place, what would we find?
Right.
Linda, thank you very much for being with us. And folks, you heard her appeal. If you have anything that might help in this case, please write Linda at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. And I can tell you from long experience, when she says confidentiality will be respected, she is serious.
Thank you, Whitley, very much.
Thank you for being with us today on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe.
You've been